Hi, thanks for joining us today. So today we will be talking about the command line interface and the SDK for LimaCharlie. All right. So, I guess as a little bit of a background, so LimaCharlie, everything that we do is done through the REST interface. And so as general statements, we can say that everything that you see on the web app is done through the public REST interface. So that means that if you see something in a web app and you would like to leverage that in some automated fashion, you always can. There's always a way. If you're having trouble finding it, just let us know. But we'll go through a lot of kind of information around it. The general setup today is going to be that we will talk a little bit about the CLI, the SDK, how authentication works. We'll go over the main things that are available in the CLI, kind of the main interfaces in the command line interface. And then we'll look at the SDK and look at the components that we really haven't touched on the CLI. Anything you see in the CLI is also available in the SDK, but it's not the other way around. Some classes are just available in the SDK so that you can develop against it. And then finally, we will pick an example and kind of step through it and show you a little bit of code, show you how that works. When we talk about the SDK today, and the CLI, really what we're talking about is the Python version, which is kind of by far the most evolved. We do have a JavaScript one, but there hasn't been quite the same demand, so we're not really updating it very actively anymore. All right. So with all this said, let's get into it. So here we go. So again, if you have some questions, feel free to put them in the chat. No problem. The latency should be a little bit lighter today, so we can also, I can also answer questions a bit more easily there. So I mentioned it. Ultimately, everything that you see in the CLI and SDK communicate with LimaCharlie through the public API that we have. There's the URL, so https API limacharlie.io. And static Swagger will be kind of the documentation, and that allows you to also interact a little bit through a web app with that particular REST API. Behind the scenes, it's all documented, in our documentation. The REST API uses a JWT which is an authentication token. To verify, permissions and all that stuff, and that is available through an API itself that allows you to take your API key and get a JWT that then you can use with the API gateway. So very basic to start with, but installing the API, both the CLI and the SDK is done in the same way. So if you just do a pip install LimaCharlie, that will, start installing. There's a couple of components to get going, and that gives you access to both. So very straightforward. Authentication is a slightly interesting story. So as you know, we are very, very multi-tenant. So that means that we wanted to make sure that the CLI and the SDK are easy to use them in a multi-tenant environment. So there's a couple of things that we can talk about. So there's API keys. So usually when we call API keys, we're referring really to kind of machine API keys. Those are organization centric. So you'll create a key, and we'll show you what that looks like in the REST API, in the web interface. You create a key. It is valid for that specific organization with those specific services, permissions rather. Then there's also a user API key. So we recommend that if you don't really need to, that you avoid using those, but those are user-centric. So what that means is, as a user, you have access to multiple organizations. You can create an API key that will have the global set of permissions that you have as a user across all those organizations. So that's a user API key, and that's done from your profile on the web app. So the authentication, very straightforward. So you just go, LimaCharlie login, and you will need to provide the organization ID and the API key, so the key itself. Again, we'll actually step through those when we get to the SDK example to give you an idea. Actually, no, we'll probably step through that pretty early on so that we can demonstrate some of the CLI. It supports multiple environments. So when you do a LimaCharlie login, if you enter an empty environment name or an alias, it will get set as your default environment. So that happens to be used whenever you use either the CLI or the SDK without any credentials. If you don't specify an API key or anything, it will try to access the default environment that you have set up. But you can add more and give them names. And to use one of those environments with the name, it's controlled via an environment variable where you can specify the name of the LimaCharlie environment. And we've made a small shortcut to just emit that environment name with the right variable. So you can do, dot to apply and then redirect the output of a LimaCharlie use and an environment name. We've gone with that scheme with environment names to be sure that you can have as a user on the same host, the same user can actually access multiple environments and different shells and different processes. Finally, once that's done, you can do a LimaCharlie who. And what that will do is it will query the public API and will actually list for you, the current API key that you're using, what the permissions are, which organizations is it valid for, the name, kind of all the basic information. So let's step through that. So to get that going, we will switch to, here we go. All right. So we'll go in a REST API. In an organization, we will create a new API key. Actually, before doing that, I will copy this, and give me a second because we will need this. All right. So, and then here's what we're going to do. We will create an API key. We will give it a name. In this case, we will just say, every single permission, just, have at it. Just for this example, it makes things simpler. And we will hit create. This creates it, and then you can copy your actual API key from to your clipboard here. So I will switch back to our Cloud Shell so that we can demonstrate what that looks like. All right, so we will just say LimaCharlie login. Now we want our organization ID. That's good. The name of this environment, we will leave it to default. And then I will go and I will copy our API key. There we go, pasted it. So this is asking us that if this is an API key for a user, so a user API key, we also want to add our user ID here to specify it in the environment. In this case, it's not, so I'll just press enter. Here we go. So everything has been set up. So if I go LimaCharlie who, here we go. So I can see that I have every permission out there for a specific organization. My identity name is test, and yeah, here's the first 4 characters of the API key that we're using. Cool. So that has our authentication. We're authenticated both for the CLI as well as the SDK. So they'll use this environment. Obviously, I haven't mentioned it, but in the SDK, sometimes you're not in a shell environment. For example, if you're creating a service or deploying cloud function or something like that, you can absolutely specify the OID and the key, in the code directly through the SDK without having it in your environment. So what can we do with the CLI? So this is kind of a high-level overview. In some cases, we'll actually, list it, like run it, so that you can see a little bit what that looks like. So searching, so detection and response. So that's fairly straightforward. You will see that you can go LimaCharlie DR and see the help. So you can manage rules, so you can list, add rules, delete them. So you can kind of, get as well a specific rule, so you can really manage the whole thing. And this is really the exact same thing as if you went through the web API. Fairly straightforward. Searching is more interesting. So the idea of the search is to allow you to do a search for IOCs, so indicators of compromise, just like you would see on the web interface, except to do it across multiple organizations. So this is more useful for people like MSSPs that come in the morning. Evil.com has been reported as a bad domain by some report somewhere, and you want to know if it's anywhere across my fleet. So I can run this from a shell interface and either go through all of my environments that are set up. I think that's the default, if I recall. Or you can also specify specific environments. So in this case, if I just take this and we run it. So in this specific case, we're only targeting a single environment. But if you had 10, 15, all this would be done in parallel. So in this case, I queried for any domain names with Microsoft contained in there. And I got this basic information, so I can see that in the last day, these are the domains that have been observed, and the number of locations, the number of hosts that have seen them. 30 days, and we have 7 days as well. So we give you slices of time. This is the summary view. You can also query for the, I forget the exact name. I think it might be the details view, which will give you location, I think. Will give you every single location where those domains have been seen, the first time and the last time. So that's available. All of those, again, are also available through the SDK. So if you want to automate as part of an app or something, a search like that, you absolutely can. It's a nice class. You can import it and operate those searches. Replay is fairly straightforward. It's just starting replay jobs. So we won't really do one. So replay, for those not aware, is the ability to take historical telemetry you have in your organization in Insight, so the retention, and a given DNR rule, so detection and response rule, and to run this rule against the historical data. So retroactive hunting, sometimes referred to, or things like that. So it's kind of it's a little bit like a search, as discussed before, except that it gives you the full power of DNR rules. So all the way into stateless, queries around like process relationship and all that stuff. Sync. So the LimaCharlie sync is a very, very useful tool that allows you to replicate organizations. So again, it's another one that's particularly useful for MSSPs. They're very multi-tenant. It allows you to take an organization and export all of its configuration to config file. You can refactor those config files a little bit as you want after. You can do includes of other config files. So you can really shape it for CI/CD pipeline. And the sync tool also allows you to go and do the opposite, which is to say, take these config files and apply them to this new organization. So, so as an MSSP, you might have kind of a boilerplate setup for one of your new customers. And when you onboard a new customer, you can just, run the command line and just push all your config, all your detection and response rules, everything to it. Spot check, also sometimes known as a fleet check, is a very interesting one. So we talked about search before. So the search is looking for an IOC in historical data, right? So I want to see if any of my hosts resolved evil.com in the past year. Spot check allows you to kind of take the mirror approach of that, which is to say, I don't want to look at historical data. I want to actively go into those hosts that are in my organization and look for specific IOCs. So it supports a bunch of different types of IOCs. So, file name paths, hashes, but you can also do Yara scans. I think if I recall, you can do looking for a handle. So there's, it should be everything that you kind of want to do in a common IR scenario. And the idea is that this command line will automate the process of figuring out, okay, which hosts are online, go to query them, look for, those specific IOCs, report whether there's a hit or not. And if some of the hosts are offline, you can ask the spot check to just, wait for those to come online, and it'll retry, it'll keep looking. And when they come online, it'll, do the check and kind of let you know the results. And so it does all this again through the REST interface, kind of an automated way. So we can show a little bit what that looks like. So here we're running a spot check, and we're saying that we only want Windows boxes. I guess technically also Chrome in this case, but so really Windows boxes. And we are looking for a file path, rather a file pattern, sorry. So we're saying within system32, I'm looking for anything .scr up to 2 depth of the directory. And so this is pretty zoomed in, so it doesn't look all that great. But what you're seeing here is kind of the report from this saying, question marks telling you, well, this host is not online, so I don't really know. The caret is telling you, I'm starting to look at this host. The bang is just saying, I found something on this host. And then if we just let this keep going, you'll see that at recurring interval, we'll reevaluate to wait for the hosts that were offline. So the idea is to make this this output format fairly easy for you to pipe to a file or pipe to something else, and grep for like line starting with bang for all the positive results and kind of modify that as you will. It's also available as a class, so you can actually kind of leverage the concept of going onto those hosts and doing these eval, but really managing it all within Python in this particular example. So that's kind of the high level things that are interesting in the CLI. Oh, actually, I forgot to mention the logs. Right. So the logs is a slightly different one in the CLI. In that it allows you to push any file to the external logs system of your organization. And to do that without having an API key. So that's the only CLI that does not require an API key. It works using access tokens, which you can also create in the web interface. And the idea is that those tokens don't have any permission other than to allow you to upload those logs. So it's the kind of thing that you could deploy to a server that you don't really want to monitor with LimaCharlie, but you want to have a cron job that pushes, the proxy logs every hour to LimaCharlie, to your organization. So you can use that CLI to do that. Yeah, and there's a lot of things that are theoretically possible. If you've worked with us, you kind of know that we like to develop against very specific use cases from our customers. That way we can make sure that what we develop actually really works for somebody, rather than kind of developing features that we don't necessarily know whether or not there's use behind it. So if you have some use cases, you have some thoughts or some tasks that you're doing fairly frequently that you'd like to be able over the CLI, to do over the CLI, do let us know. It'll be a pleasure. So the SDK is kind of the next part of this. So I mentioned it. All CLI functionality is available in the Python SDK. The SDK is on GitHub, so you can find the link in our documentation. I guess I didn't put it here. Right, so let's get into it a little bit. So the main way that the SDK works is really around one core class, which is called the manager. And again, we'll go through actual, basic code and show you a real demo of this. But the idea, the concept here is that this manager allows you to, the manager manages all API calls, all the actual interaction with the API gateway. So that's where you will set the organization ID, the API key, or an environment. And a lot of the kind of fairly common functionality is available directly from the manager class. You'll see that more advanced functionality, very often you instantiate it and you have to give it a manager. So pretty much in all cases, the first thing you want to do is instantiate a manager and kind of go from there. Just seeing, yeah, cool. So somebody on the chat talking about Swagger. Yes, we're really happy with the Swagger for the interactive stuff. I think there's a few other frameworks that allow you to do kind of interactive APIs through a web page that are even better. So hopefully in the future we'll make it that even better. Right. So this is kind of a somewhat exhaustive list of what you can do through the manager, but the general idea is, auth is managed there. You will see that there's this concept of interactive manager. So either you can pass it as a flag when you create it, or you can make a manager interactive afterwards with make interactive. And all that is doing is creating a pipe from LimaCharlie down to your manager for real-time communication. So by default, it's really one way. It makes API calls. But when you say interactive, what you're saying is, I want to interrogate in real-time sensors from this instance of the API, of the SDK rather. And so that will set up the HTTP tunnel, HTTPS tunnel, to get the responses from your taskings. And we'll actually use that in the example. But you can, list sensors, very obvious stuff. You can do a lot of useful kind of basic searches, which I think is a bit of an underrated feature. So you can search for a sensor by hostname, fine. You can also search for a sensor by historical IP. So let's say you have like a big log file somewhere during an IR, and there's an IP that hit, your internal web server or something like that. And you would just like to know at 2 a.m. that day, which host on your network had this IP. So you can actually do a super fast query against it. So you just give it the IP, the time range, and we'll list you all of these sensors that had this IP, either internal or external during that time. So really cool. So outputs, so you can create all your forwarders. Again, it's done through the manager. Managing DNR rules, also false positive rules, same. You can also get historical data from your, if you have Insight, so data retention enabled. So you can query historically for data from sensors or detections, all through the API. Searching for IOCs, which we've covered before. get IOC prevalence. Again, it's pretty much the same thing. External service requests. So as we're growing the list of kind of secondary services that we offer, so now we have things like, the dumper that dumps the memory, physical memory from a box. We'll have Zeek. Eventually, we'll have payload detonation. So things like that. This class will allow you to send a specific request to one of those servers, one of those services, rather. Managing ingestion keys. So as we mentioned for logs, they're the access token, so you can manage it there. You can also do really more management stuff like changing the quota, subscribing or unsubscribing from resources and services, and managing users can also all be done here. We have a class for payloads. So the payloads class allows you to create, so both upload as well as list and delete the payloads, and those are arbitrary executable that you can push to the LimaCharlie cloud. And then you're able to either interactively or the SDK or CLI or in the live view on the web or even DNR rules, you can actually automate the deployment of those executables with arguments on those hosts. So, for example, if you're doing a very, very specific detection of some APT in the network, and really you have this custom executable given to you by the FBI, and you want to run it everywhere to get some information or to do the cleanup, you would use payloads. So you can to kind of automate that process. Firehose and Spout are, I think it's a bit less likely you're going to need them directly. But the Firehose is just you starting an endpoint, a TCP endpoint, to receive a data flow from LimaCharlie. So, and from an output in LimaCharlie. So if you're forwarding data using an output in your organization, the Firehose is just a class that will automate like generating some SSL certs or using some SSL certs and kind of getting all that stuff and receiving it over TCP. The Spout is kind of a mirror version of that, and you actually use it all the time in your browser when you go live with the sensor. So the way that we can have LimaCharlie, instead of having LimaCharlie reach out to your box, which sometimes has issues with NAT, so network address translation on networks. Oh, are you having? So somebody's saying that there's issues with the sound. I'm just gonna, and that seems to work here. Is the sound back? Can you let me know if everything's still good? Okay, perfect. It happens. So right, so the Spout, instead of you having to maybe open up a port in your NAT or your DMZ and stuff like that, the Spout allows you to reach out to an HTTP server, so outbound over HTTPS, and get that same stream. So you use it when the browser you go over, go live. This is actually exactly what you're using. The browser is using this Spout method, which is documented if you want to run it yourself, to connect through one of our streaming gateways that we call. That essentially they get the traffic from LimaCharlie, and then you connect to it to get your version of it. So this allows you to access in real time, get a real-time pipe from anywhere without having to worry too much about networking. As long as HTTPS goes out, you're good to go. So that's a little bit of the overview of what you can do. So what I wanted to do after is let's step through an example of a little bit of code that will kind of give you a little bit of the flavor of what it looks like doing a little bit of interaction with the SDK specifically, and that hopefully you'll see that it's surprisingly easy to kind of play with and build automations. So I have, this is the little bit of code that I wanted to step through. So I think what we'll do is that I will open up in my shell, and we'll kind of go as we go, and I'll narrate a little bit what's going on. So let's start Python. All right, so, very basic. In this case, we'll just import what we need. So we will need the LimaCharlie SDK and JSON, just because we'll format some JSON that we want to output to the screen. So as I mentioned, the manager is kind of the core library. So whenever you're starting to do something in the SDK, this is pretty much what you will want to instantiate. So we're going to call it LC. And the parameters that you can see, we're giving you two parameters. So one is interactive, and we're saying it is. And the other one is the investigation ID. So is interactive says, hey, yeah, I want to get direct real-time feedback from my sensors. The investigation ID is a unique identifier that that we will use to track the commands that you're sending through, as well as all the responses coming back. So we will we'll use that. So in this case, we're specifying it's an arbitrary string. In real life, you probably want to use some random thing. So we often use a UUID that we generate. But in some specific cases, it might be useful to use a static value to trace or to do a little bit of a distributed service. It's more complex. So we've instantiated. It took a split second for the object to get created. That's because we created this output. But now it's going. So there's a real HTTPS connection back. So the first thing we're going to do is we will find out which sensors that we have in our organizations, which ones are online. So creating an array, and I will iterate through lc.sensors. And that's a generator if you're a Python developer, meaning if you have like 2 million sensors, it'll still work fine. We'll iterate over it. For every sensor, we'll ask if it's online. If it is, then we'll add that object to our array. So I will just run this. So we're doing this a little bit naively in the sense that we're going one by one, checking if it's online. Here we go. If you're building more advanced services, you might want to do things that parallelize some of this, and we actually have helpful classes for this in the SDK that allow you to specify tasks that you want to run in parallel, because so much of this uses a REST interface, so it's very asynchronous. So, okay, that's good. So we ran this. Let's now see. We're just going to okay, so we have 2 sensors online. That's easy. So next, what we'll do is we will do a little bit of reconnaissance on those boxes. So first is we'll define a new list that we'll call suspicious. And now we will iterate over the agents that are online. And we will do a simple request. So a simple request is pretty much what it sounds like. We're sending a task to that agent, and we want to synchronously receive a response, the data coming back from that task. There's other more complex ways to do requests, with futures or ways you don't have to wait for it. But again, we're sticking to the simpler stuff. So let's start putting this in. All right, so now we're going to do this. And we will get the response in services. So that's going to be the response, the data coming back. If you're wondering what it looks like, what the response looks like, test it. It's always the easiest way. Just run it and see what comes back. Otherwise, you can go in the historical view on the web app and just look at the events there. It's going to be the exact same thing, same format, the JSON. So in our case, what we'll do is we will take a specific part of this answer, which is in the event. So the data coming back has an event and routing. So two components. Routing is just information about the host where this is coming from. Event is the payload, the data. So we're going to take the data and we're going to look in SVCS, which is services, is just where that's going to be the list of all the services that are on this box. So we'll take this, and then we're going to do something for each of those services. So we're going to take that list of service, and then we're going to iterate through it. So first we're going to say, well, if this is not a Windows box, just keep going. It's not in a very efficient spot, but just showing a little bit what you can do with a sensor object. So if it's not Windows, keep going. If there's no file is signed, which is the component of the coming back in a service that tells you if the file represented by the service is signed or not. So if that value is not in the service, it can be some corner cases in Windows where a file wasn't specified for service or things like that. So if it's not in there, we'll just ignore that service. And finally, okay, now we have a Windows service and we have an indication of whether or not the file is signed. Perfect. So we're going to print the host name of that sensor. So sensor.hostname, simple as that. And then we're going to print a pretty version of the JSON of coming from of that service. And finally, we will add this particular sensor to the list of suspicious sensors that we have going. Pardon me, I will reissue that. I didn't copy paste all the way. There we go. All right. So now I just started this. Here we go. We just ran. Remember, we had 2 hosts online, so it didn't take too long. We can see that demo win 2012 is the host name where we found a file that is not signed, a service that's not signed. And then we're just printing the details of that service. So whatever this is with the file and everything there. So, okay, that's cool. Now suspicious will really have just one sensor in there. So let's try something a little bit different with it. So far we've interacted directly in real time with that box, right? We've listed actively the services and checked those out. Now let's try to do something a bit more interesting as well. We're going to go through the list of suspicious sensors. In this case, there's just one. We're going to tag that particular sensor with the tag unsigned SVC, which is arbitrary. It's just something we want to use for our own purposes. And that tag will remain there for 1 hour. So for the next hour, the sensor will be tagged. Maybe we'll use this tag in some other part of IR that we're doing. The second thing we're going to do is I'm going to query LimaCharlie. So not the agent directly, but really LimaCharlie. And we're going to say sensor.get historic events. So this is saying, LimaCharlie, go in your retention and get the historic events for this box. And the 2 parameters you can see here are the start time and the end time. So here we're saying start 1 hour ago and end right now. So give me all of the events that I got from this box in the last hour. And then that's potentially, a non-trivial amount of data. So I will just print the number of events that I have in there. So if we just go here. There we go. There we go. So this is a demo box. Nothing's really going on it. So you can see it's very, very low chatter in the last hour. We had 37 events. So it's not a whole lot, but these are events that are now like in your code available. And in fact, so if I want to just show one for reference, it's a list. So you can see I have, all the details of that event. So you can see how you can really extremely easily start interacting with your sensors, both in real time, but also query historical, events, get them in your script, run the transform, look for the things that you're interested in. You could also then, turn around and do an IOC search for, a specific unsigned file to see historically if you've seen it somewhere else. So you can kind of leverage all of the features that are available in LimaCharlie. You could also turn around and say, you know what, dump our service, dump the physical memory from this box and upload it to LimaCharlie so that I can run volatility on it, things like that. It's extremely powerful as, as a glue to everything that you do in LimaCharlie. We use the SDK ourselves for vast majority of the services that we produce. So it's it's very much kind of a first class citizen for us. So this kind of concludes the demo around the SDK. It's it's one of those things that has a whole lot of power and a whole lot of depth. So I kind of encourage you to have a look at the public repo we have. So get on GitHub, so /refactionpoint/python-LimaCharlie. And from there, you'll also find some samples of code that do, various bits and pieces to give you some ideas. And you'll also find the actual reference documentation to the API itself. I don't know if there's any questions. The CLI and SDK tends to be sometimes a bit more of a dry topic. Hopefully it was a good overview. So yeah, I'll just give it a couple of seconds to go over the delay, see if there's any questions. Otherwise, feel free to hit us up on the Slack channel. Always happy to answer questions. Or also, given the kind of the scope of the LimaCharlie ecosystem, it's also very useful often to bounce some ideas with us. So if you have, you want to accomplish task X, and there might be a couple of different ways, we can point you in the right direction in terms of, the SDK or the API, which part you'd likely want to leverage or is going to work better for you. All right. So I don't believe there are any questions. Cool. So, well, join us next time. And not sure exactly what the topic will be for next week, but yeah, hopefully happy hunting. Thanks.